Good morning, everybody. Let's get started, please. I want to welcome everyone today to the Strategic Investment Successfully Preparing for Business with Cuba webinar. My name is Ray Ruga, and I'm founder of the FinTech America's Banking Disruption Conference, and I will be the moderator of this event. Once again, thank you all for taking time to join us today. And also, before we get going, I want to encourage you to all ask questions. Questions can be submitted, and then we will hopefully get to them all, or as many as we can, at the end of our presentations. And as all of you know, Cuba is front and center these days. Having surprised the international community last December with an unexpected reapproachment, the Obama administration has moved quickly and deliberately to reestablish diplomatic relations, creating an outpouring of interest from the business community to the possibility of doing business with or in the island. While relations with Cuba have been established and the U.S. now has a full embassy there, the fact remains that there is still a U.S. embargo in place that will require congressional approval for its lifting. Just last Friday, I was privileged to have been invited to a speech by former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, where she advocated for the full lifting of the U.S. embargo, potentially paving the way for business to pursue investment opportunities in the island. However, while there is potential in this undoubtedly sexy topic, there remains a lot of challenges for would-be investors beyond the U.S. embargo, which is why we're here today. Joining us are two distinguished experts to provide us with presentations on the subject. First up will be Marla Ducaran, Group Economist for the Royal Bank of Canada's Caribbean operations, who brings with her over 17 years of experience as an economist. She is responsible for monitoring over 20 countries in the Caribbean and has placed intensive focus on preparing international stakeholders for the impending opening of the Cuban market. Marla is regarded as one of the top thought leaders in the Caribbean on key macroeconomic issues. Marla's depth of knowledge has converted her into a key influencer for regional businesses, and she is considered by Global News Matters as one of the women to watch in the Caribbean. Also joining us today is Melissa Marchand, Global News Matters Chief Strategy Officer, who combines hands-on experience in the oil and gas, electricity, manufacturing, and financial services sector, with broad knowledge and extensive consulting work in the Caribbean economies. Over the last decade, Melissa has helped companies from around the world develop new strategies to excel in the Caribbean region and has been advising multinationals on Cuban affairs for the last 5 years. Her specialized knowledge in the Dutch, French, English, and Spanish Caribbean markets position her as one of the top experts globally for the region. We welcome them both, and to get started, Marla will take it from the top. Welcome, Marla.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Ray. Good morning and hello to everyone on the line, and thank you so much for joining us. Before I start, I really want to again thank Melissa and Global News Matters for inviting me to co-host this webinar. This is a subject that I'm so excited about because it just represents so much opportunity for Cuba as well as the rest of the region. And so if we could bring up the next slide, I want to really remind everyone on the call that Cuba is, it's not your typical economy. I mean, it's a centrally planned economy, which means that the state controls most of the resources. There are heavy restrictions still on the ownership, private ownership and operation of businesses. The government controls the majority of what is produced, who produces it, in what quantities, and at what prices the output is sold. They also control all employment and wages and all prices in the economy. So once we remember this at the back of our minds, we can get into the data. Next slide, please. So, the outline of my presentation is going to be fairly simple. I'm going to get into what the current macro conditions look like in Cuba. I'm going to talk a bit about demographics, consumption and investment, tourism, and trade especially. I also then want to spend a little bit of time on what this rapprochement process means in terms of the implications for Cuba as well as touch on what the implications might be for some of the other countries in the Caribbean. And then after that, I'll wrap up and hand over to our host. Next slide, please. So, in terms of the demographics for Cuba, the population of Cuba is roughly 11.2 million, which is actually the largest in the Caribbean, just slightly larger than Haiti or the Dominican Republic. And interestingly, I mean, over 1.5 million people are in the over 65 age group. That's larger than the population of Trinidad. So they do have a large older population, but they also have, in terms of the birth rate relatively to the Caribbean, their population grew by only 0.3% in 2013, which is fairly consistent with the kind of population growth we see throughout the Caribbean, except that a 0.3% growth rate in Cuba translates into 37,000 persons. And so, if you think about that on the scale relative to the rest of the Caribbean, you can see where that growth in Cuba, even with 0.3%, it really is way over and above what we see in the rest of the Caribbean. Again, about 19% of the population are senior citizens, and there's a dependency ratio of roughly 55%. And that is, again, might be high in a sense, but in a regional scale in the Caribbean, it's quite average. Next slide, please. So, in terms of Cuba's workforce, the total workforce stands at just under 5 million persons, and the largest segment in terms of employment would be other activities, services to commercial and individuals, and that's at 40% of the workforce, followed by agriculture and retail, hotels and restaurants. Now, retail, hotels and restaurants is the only sector that has shown uninterrupted growth in employment numbers for each year from 2008 to 2013. And the reason for that, I suspect, is because workers in the retail and hotel sector can actually have the opportunity to earn US dollars informally from tourists to supplement their formal wages. The electricity, gas, and water sector has seen the most growth in employment numbers from 2008 to 2013 at 24%, followed closely by mining and quarrying. So basically, your utilities, they are the ones that are showing the most growth. We have seen, however, business services, real estate, rentals showing declines of about 17% in employment numbers from 2008 to 2013. The manufacturing sector also saw declines of 13.6% in employment numbers over that period. And according to Moody's, there was a 74% labor force participation rate and a 3.5% unemployment rate in 2012. 20% of the population works in the agriculture sector, but that sector accounts for only 5% of gross value add in the economy. And this illustrates very weak productivity levels that pervade the Cuban economy. Next slide, please. In terms of the average monthly salary, the levels you see here until 2013, of course, have not changed very much. We suspect it might have gotten up to $24 to $25 in 2014. And the highest wages are earned in the construction sector, whereas the lowest, again, as I mentioned before, in retail, hotels. And I think the reason why wages are suppressed in that sector is because of the shift that we spoke about in the last slide of employment numbers into that sector. And people are attracted to working in that sector because of the possibility of earning US dollars informally from tourists as opposed to just relying on formal wages. Incidentally, all private hiring must be done via the state agencies still. And so this is seen as an impediment to increasing private sector activity in Cuba, and it's one of the reforms that is needed going forward. Next slide, please. So let's talk a bit about consumption. So household consumption has basically increased by about 40% nominally, but in real terms, just about 18% from 2008 to 2014. And as the chart shows, most of the growth in consumption has been satisfied by the farm and livestock markets and the markets of the self-employed, which are increasing actually, while the state markets have seen slower growth, and that's possibly due to their relative size and larger base, but also it suggests that there is growth momentum with respect to private enterprise in this sector in Cuba. And the steady increase in household consumption since 2009, whilst real wages have grown only marginally, as we saw in a previous slide, is partly attributable to the relaxation of remittance inflows from the US and also due to increases in tourism activity. On the remittances, the US they quadrupled their restriction on the quota of allowable remittances from 500 US per quarter to 2,000 US per quarter. And Moody's estimates that Cuban emigres sent over 3.5 billion US dollars in remittances to Cuba in 2013, or roughly 4.4% of GDP. Despite this is when the US $500 per quarter restriction was in place. So what Moody's is saying is that there will be a quadrupling of this level of inflows over the next 2 to 3 years. So we can see 3.5 billion grow to 12 billion US dollars in the next 2 to 3 years is what Moody's is saying. Next slide, please. So we have about 10,000 registered businesses in Cuba. Over half of them are in agriculture, livestock, and forestry. Cooperatives is the only category of business type that has shown growth in 2014 at 1.6%. And overall, the total number of registered businesses in Cuba in 2014 recorded a year-on-year decline of 2.2%. And the only sectors showing growth in the number of registered businesses in 2014 were the supply of electricity, gas, and water. So again, the utilities, which we saw earlier in terms of the shift of employment. Transport, storage, and communications were up 156%. Culture and transport and also other activities were also up. Next slide, please. In terms of investment, which is done mostly via the state, investment reached US 5.2 billion in 2013, which is up roughly 13% year on year. And most of that we saw going to hotels and restaurants for the first time. In 2013, they saw the highest level of investment. Education saw the largest increase at 60%, but again at $802 million US. Hotels and restaurants saw the largest investment level at 33%. According to Moody's, the Cuban economy suffers from chronic underinvestment. Gross investment averaged 9.4% of GDP between 2009 and 2013. And following 5 years of gradual and modest structural reforms that sought to liberalize the economy, there is scant evidence that material progress has been made, according to Moody's. Despite the reforms, the economic model continues to stifle private sector development, fostering continued inefficiencies and economic rigidities typical of a centrally planned system. So could we have the next slide, please? I want to talk a little bit about tourism. Now, we've all heard recently in the news of the sudden rush to visit Cuba. Cuba attracted over 3 million stopover arrivals in 2014. And this is without meaningful airlift from the US. The only country in the Caribbean that sees higher numbers is the Dominican Republic. Up to May this year so far, stopovers crossed 1.7 million already, which is up 15.2% year over year, according to the Caribbean Tourism Organization. Now, some data according to the World Travel and Tourism Council. Travel and tourism contributed over 8 billion Cuban pesos to the Cuban economy in 2014, or 10.4% of GDP. The industry accounts for 9.6% of total employment in 2014 and 15.5% of total investment, according to the World Travel and Tourism Council. From the year 2000 to 2013, Cuba recorded the highest average annual level of capital investment in tourism in the whole Caribbean at roughly 1.1 billion US dollars per annum on average, and this includes FDI. In the Caribbean, Cuba has one of the lowest levels of economic dependence on tourism at roughly 10% of GDP. Occupancy levels in Cuba averaged about 45% in 2013 and 46% in 2014. So these numbers that you're seeing on the chart at 3 million stopovers, that's just 46% occupancy levels. Overnight stays of about 1.9 million in 2014 indicate that the average length of stay was just about 6 nights on average, and at this occupancy level, it suggests that they could possibly accommodate twice as many visitors as they had done in 2014, just to give you some perspective as to how much more can they take. In 2013, there were 431 hotels in Cuba and 63,719 rooms. Next slide, please. Canada is actually their largest source market for stopover tourism arrivals in Cuba, which is, they account for just under 40% of total arrivals. And US, you would see captured under the light blue quarter, and it's captured under other, basically. Up to May of this year, as I mentioned, we had a growth of about 15.2% year over year in stopover arrivals. Canadian stopovers grew by 13.4%, Europeans by 14.2%, and other, which captures the US, is up almost 19% year over year, up to May of this year. From 2009 to 2014, stopover arrivals from Venezuela showed the fastest growth at 22%, followed by China at 18% growth. In 2014 alone, there was an almost 71.6% increase in stopover arrivals from Venezuela, the highest increase by far, to almost 79,000 visitors from Venezuela. Arrivals from China grew in 2014 at 27% to about 28,000 visitors. Other arrivals, which is where America, US is captured, was up 10.7% from 2009 to 2014. And in 2014 alone, grew by 38% to 755,000 stopover arrivals. Only England, Italy, and Spain showed declines in stopover arrivals to Cuba from 2009 to 2014. And so some estimates from US firms currently allowed to organize travel to Cuba suggest that demand from American visits could triple in 2015. And so they're expecting an increase of about 300,000 visitors. And as they're seeing interest rising significantly. The only constraint that they're seeing is that most of your higher end properties, tourism properties in Cuba are pretty much running at full capacity. So right now, you only have the more budget conscious properties available with surplus capacity. Next slide, please. So we're going to talk a bit about growth, inflation, and fiscal, the real macro stuff. In terms of growth, you would see in this slide that we've, in 2014, we were down from the highs. I mean, growth at 1.4%, and this was largely precipitated by what's going on in Venezuela. Basically, the officials are projecting around 4% growth in this year, given that in the first half of this year, they saw growth estimated at just over 4%, based on better performance in manufacturing, construction, retail, and wholesale. The EIU, they're actually forecasting growth at 4.4%, up from 4.1%, citing strong tourism growth. All of this, I think, is still dependent on not just what's happening in Venezuela, but they also have local constraints to address. And so 4% might seem reasonable, as well as depending on how things progress, it might come in a little bit softer than that. Next slide, please. In terms of the sectors, you have the largest sectors being commerce and repairs at 19%, public health and social assistance 17%, manufacturing excluding sugar at 13%. Those are the largest sectors, whereas science and technology, hotels and restaurants, as I mentioned earlier, business services and real estate are the ones that are growing fastest. Next slide, please. Cuba has had relatively subdued inflation, but that's pretty much a function of tight price controls exercised by the government. In the middle of last year, middle of 2014, the government announced that they're going to implement some monetary reform starting this year into 2017 that unifies two currencies, the CUC and the CUP, the Cuban peso. And if this reform does take hold, it could have an inflationary impact. The other inflationary impact might also come from the fact that if Cuba increasingly has to go to the open market to buy fuel, where Venezuela has fallen short, it means that they're going to have to pay market prices as opposed to subsidized prices that they get from Venezuela. And that's going to have an inflationary impact throughout the economy. Next slide, please. According to Moody's, um, Cuba's fiscal deficit tends to be low simply because they don't have access to international finance for their deficit. So it means they, subject to these constraints, they have no choice but to exercise fiscal restraint. That for sure is part of the reason, but whatever it is, the point is they do run deficits, but generally deficits, on average about 2% of GDP, which is not unusual in this region. Lots of countries in this region run much higher deficits on a consistent basis. Next slide, please. So in terms of exports, Cuba, relative to the rest of the region, has a well-diversified export base, which includes minerals. Cuba actually has the fifth largest nickel reserves in the world. They also include agricultural produce, livestock, tobacco, etc. And a large portion of Cuba's nickel is actually refined in Canada. Next slide, please. So that makes Canada one of Cuba's largest trading partners. But Venezuela is, however, the single largest trading partner at about 43% of Cuba's exports. Next slide, please. And if you look at Cuba's imports as well, Venezuela is also the largest source market for Cuba's imports, again, at about 44%. And most of that would be fuel and oil, as mentioned earlier, under that agreement, which is similar to PetroCaribe with Venezuela. Next slide, please. So, just to talk about some of the implications of this rapprochement process. From my perspective, I think, we saw recently that the US government has actually made travel for US citizens easier to Cuba. So they're steadily removing restrictions, whereas we did not see the reverse happen in Cuba. And I think part of the reason for that is I think the Cuban authorities are aware that they might have an outward migration problem when they do, or if they do relax their travel restrictions on their citizens. Possibly some brain drain as well. I mean, which is a factor throughout the Caribbean. Another issue that I see in the short to medium term is that unification of the dual currency system that I mentioned before, potentially causing price disruptions, but it is a critical and necessary reform that has to take place because it creates all kinds of distortion in the economy and prices right now. The state control of banking sector, there are about 10 banks in Cuba and 9.5 of them are controlled by the state, the other half of one controlled by Venezuela. We saw that they were able to establish correspondent banking relationships with a bank in Florida, but I think that the level of control in this industry is a constraint to FDI and to international business activity taking place, probably also affecting productivity. Uh, Also, there's a high level of uncertainty regarding political transition and succession in the current regime that could place a dampener on confidence and FDI inflows. And again, Venezuela's economic challenges could also continue to place some sort of dampening effect on Cuba's overall macroeconomy as well as inflows of FDI. One critical thing in terms of Cuba's ability to trade with the rest of the world and with the US, as that is increasingly possible, is the availability of US dollars. Because Venezuela has been Cuba's largest trading partner for years, that issue was really not that much of a concern because of the high level of barter arrangement that was involved in their trade. And so now that you have to use US dollars to trade internationally, I think that's going to be also a challenge for the Cuban economy in as we go forward. Next slide, please. So I just want to touch briefly before I close on what are some of the experts saying about what the likely impact might be for the rest of the region. There were a couple of papers done by the IMF. I think they're updating this paper right now, the 2011 paper. And incidentally, what they said is that an opening of Cuba to US tourism would represent a seismic shift in the Caribbean's tourism industry. An industry-wide shock such as this occurs only once in 100 years. And what they were saying is that there would be a substitution effect that basically pulls tourists away from neighboring US-dependent tourist markets such as Jamaica, Bahamas, for example, and those tourists would be because of the price and income substitution effect will shift to Cuba instead. Next slide, please. The IDB also did a paper that had similar conclusions, although they saw that Barbados would actually benefit as the European travelers shifted to other territories away from Cuba, which we saw a bit of that happening. As I mentioned earlier, we saw declines in some of the European market arrivals. Now, this slide from the IDB is showing, and they're contending that CARICOM has already been losing market share to Cuba, and this is without the whole rapprochement process beginning in the US. Next slide, please. And finally, some work done by an aviation research company called Boyd Group International. They weren't quite as optimistic as I've seen some analysts be. They're saying that lifting the trade embargo will not result in an avalanche of new business for Cuba. Cuba today can and does trade freely with the rest of the world. Unfortunately, their economy has been engineered to the point that it produces little, and the nation has been on at least partial life support for most of the last half century, first from the Soviet Union and more recently from Venezuela. There will certainly be opportunities for travel growth to Cuba, but only after a whole galaxy of economic and political planets align. That's according to Boyd Group International. And so if we go to my last slide, just to summarize at a very high level, there is a lot of potential for Cuba, and I think there is a lot of potential for the rest of the region as well. But it's not going to happen overnight. We have quite some time and quite a lot of work that has to be done. But I think we have to be deliberate in preparing to harness these opportunities as well as in mitigating the possible risks. And so I will end there, and I will turn it back over to our host, Ray.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was fantastic. And now on to, before we go to Melissa, just remind everybody, if you have any questions, please submit them. And after Melissa's done, we will then go to the question and answer period. Melissa, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ray, and good morning to everyone. I'd like to start off by thanking you all for joining us today to take a closer look at what has traditionally been a very evasive market for many companies. I'd like to thank Marla for her insights, and I'm sure that everyone now has a clearer understanding of some of the fundamentals of Cuba's economy. If you want to go ahead and bring up my slides. Now I'd like to shift focus to the market, and I really want to get into some of the details on the business outlook. We do, as Ray just mentioned, we do want to make sure you get what you came for, so please submit your questions in the question panel. We're going to take a look at some specific sectors, and I'll be sharing important information on foreign investment in Cuba, as well as some of the risks and opportunities that me and the team here at Global News Matters have really had a close eye on. If I can get my first slide, please. We're going to start off today by taking a look at where we are. I'm not going to get into the details of all of the pieces of legislation that are on the slide. What is important here is to see that, in fact, there has been quite a bit of movement. I need the calendar slide, please. Quite a bit of movement in U.S. Congress, as well as with the Obama administration on the matter of policy related to Cuba. Since Obama announced the change in stance on Cuba, we've seen travel limitations have been eased, correspondent banking relationships have been authorized and are now in place, remittances were increased, the amount of goods that travelers can bring back with them from Cuba was set at $400. Trade terms were changed from cash in advance to cash before transfer of title. Telecommunications companies can now do business with Cuba, and of course, now we're seeing the opening of the embassies. So there have been a lot of major advances, and as you can see here on the slide, Congress has also been very busy drafting up legislative proposals. The other thing I want to stress here is that there is also a lot that hasn't happened to facilitate business with Cuba. A few things to keep in mind are, first, that only Congress can repeal the embargo, and there are a lot of changes that still have to happen on the legislative front. Also keep in mind that Cuba has its own restrictions in place and its own limitations. A good example of this is with services trade, where U.S. companies can now import certain services from Cuban entrepreneurs. But the government of Cuba has restrictions on them exporting those services. This means that no business takes place unless Cuba reforms its own trade policies. So there's a long way to go, and changes still have to happen in both countries in order to truly normalize relations. Can I have the next slide, please? Now we're going to get into the business outlook. We're going to start off by taking a look at some of the specific challenges within the Cuban market, since many of you may be looking at this market for the very first time. So as we go through this, I want you to think of these challenges as gaps, and they're gaps that can be closed. So just ask yourself, what's the opportunity here when we start looking at these things? There are many types of market distortions in Cuba. There's some basic facts which are really important to understand. The agricultural sector, for example, is plagued with low productivity. About 70% of the food consumed in Cuba is imported. Trade is not just a challenge in terms of economics, and we'll take a specific look at the trade sector a little later on. But just for now, consider that one of the reasons that Cuba has been missing economic targets is transportation and logistics. It's the result of underinvestment, so it's not going to be corrected in a few weeks or a few months. The dual exchange rate system is supposed to be phased out, but the government has not yet gotten clear with the market about what the exchange rate is going to be. And that has left a lot of speculation. In fact, the government has given mixed signals to the market. There's a lot of ambiguity and uncertainty around the exchange rate. Another thing to keep in mind is, just in general, when looking at the economy, is that Cuba historically was heavily subsidized by the Soviet Union. And through the years, the reliance has switched to Venezuela. Cuba cannot expect to continue to receive $10 to $12 billion a year in support from Venezuela, since Venezuela is dealing with its own deep economic crisis. Cuba's government needs to quickly find new sources of foreign currency, and that is actually going to take some time. You have a high market concentration in the state sector. The state sector is highly inefficient because there's an absence of competition. Proof of this is that 65 state-run companies posted losses in the first quarter of this year, and these are companies that are budgeting for earnings and delivering losses. Now, if we look to the right, we've been seeing reforms in recent years, though they seem to have slowed down over the last year, 18 months. One of the things that's most interesting of all of these reforms has been the greater flexibility for the so-called private business. It's important to keep in mind that growth in the self-employed, they call it the cuentapropista sector, it's also offsetting reductions in government payrolls. And at the end of last year, 27% of restaurants and repair services were already being managed by private entities. So this includes the cooperatives as well as the cuentapropistas. Under the model, the state retains property over the means of production, but equipment and tools can be rented or sold. Cuentapropistas they're not accessing financing, which is another challenge. At the end of last year, there had only been 820 loans granted to cuentapropistas, and at that time, there were around 450,000 workers in the sector. Service taxes, or service tax revenues for the state are growing from the self-employed, the cuentapropista sector, which is basically the reflection of three things. First, you have the number of self-employed that is now over 500,000. Second, the self-employed are increasing their revenues. And third, the government is becoming more efficient at collecting taxes from the sector. Can I have the next slide, please? Now we're going to take a look at a few of the top business sectors to get a better sense of what's going on in the market. So starting off with tourism, and Marla spoke to tourism a little bit. I'm not going to repeat what she said. I have some different things to discuss here. The sector was sort of inching along since 2011 until last year when I hit a new milestone of 3 million tourists. This year, it reached the 2 million mark on July 10th and grew almost 16% in the first half of the year. Easing conditions on U.S. travelers are expected to make a difference, but even with all of the restrictions on travel that were in place last year, the U.S. still brought over 386,000 visitors to Cuba. And through July of this year, U.S. travelers to Cuba, and this is excluding Cuban Americans, so the non-Cuban Americans only, increased by more than 50% in the first 7 months of the year to almost 89,000. So the figure could reach 145,000 by the end of the year. Cuban American arrivals during the period for the 7-month period were 164,000. U.S. businesses have been stepping into the market. We've seen Cheap Air, Kayak, Airbnb, and several others. And we're also seeing an increase in airlift as well as cruise options. And ferries are just waiting for their permits from the authorities in Cuba in order to be able to begin their services. The sector, it also has a very healthy investment pipeline. There's infrastructure upgrades planned and hotel construction projects as well. One final detail about the tourism sector that I'd like to give you is that the sector contributes about $2.5 billion a year in foreign currency to Cuba. And so I just want to keep that number, $2.5 billion for tourism. Just keep that on your mind. Okay, can I have the next slide, please? Okay, now getting into trade. When we look at goods trade, there's a clear gap where Cuba exports about $8 billion less than it imports. One of the major problems is that containers arrive full and they leave empty, and that has both real and opportunity costs. The logistics and transportation sectors also need capital investment. Transport reforms and policy are going to be a key part of that. The railway system and vehicle transport have both registered low availability this year. Difficulty getting spare parts and maintenance problems are a major part of the issue. Cargo transport missed its targets in the first half of the year by 700,000 tons, which, just to bring that into perspective, relates to 1.9 million tons that's currently forecast for the rest of the year, for the entire year. So that's a major miss. We can't talk about trade without mentioning Mariel. The port expansion project cost over $800 million. It was funded by Brazil, built by Odebrecht, and it's operated by PSA out of Singapore. Mariel has capacity for 1 million containers per year, and it's currently operating at about 40% of capacity. Mariel also has a special economic zone, and we'll discuss that a little bit more when I touch on investing in Cuba. Getting into energy, and I can stop on this a little more in the Q&A session if anyone wants. In the interest of sticking to the schedule, I'm just going to make a few points. Cuba has set out to generate 24% of its electricity from renewables by 2030. Currently, 94% of generation is coming from thermal energy, so there's a major gap. The sector requires about $3.7 billion in investment to upgrade its infrastructure. With regards to oil and gas, the embargo is a major issue for drilling equipment. There are only 2 offshore rigs in the world that are embargo compliant. And then on top of that, you have reforms in Mexico that made it a lot more attractive to drill offshore there. So there's still a lot of changes that have to occur for the sector to really take off in Cuba. Now, turning to the healthcare export sector, a lot of people may be unaware of the highly successful pharmaceuticals industry in Cuba. Erythropoietin is one of the most commonly known Cuban pharmaceuticals products. It's a treatment for diabetic foot. And we've heard at numerous international healthcare conferences, doctors from the US that are very eager to get this treatment onto the US market because it's been proven to improve outcomes for patients. So the 70,000 people in the US that are facing amputations this year could actually have a better alternative if relations with Cuba continue to improve. That's just one of the medications, and there are also vaccines and cancer treatments and other pharmaceuticals that have had a lot of success in other markets. As far as medical exports, medical service exports go, there continues to be demand for medical services on the international market. So it just becomes a question of how fast can Cuba really prepare and train physicians to work in other parts of the world. Now, you remember I asked you to keep the $2.5 billion in foreign currency generated from tourism on your mind. The healthcare sector generates $8 billion in foreign currency for Cuba. So, I think it's a very important sector for everyone to be watching. Now, moving on to agriculture, tobacco, and sugar. The first thing to point out is that Cuba has not been exempt from the drought that nearly all of the Caribbean islands are facing this year. Reservoir levels are very low. Cuba suffers from low agriculture productivity, which I mentioned earlier. About 70% of production is sold to government at 30 to 50% below market prices, which is a major incentive buster. Transportation challenges are another difficulty for the sector. The state-run agribusiness is very inefficient, and overall last year, around half of agricultural lands were completely unused. Getting into the sugar sector, the sugar harvest was up 18% in the first half of this year, and that sounds like a great result. It was the highest production in over a decade. However, mills operated at only 65% of capacity. And the industry is far from where it was back in its glory days. Last year, sugar production amounted to 1.8 million tons, and just a few decades ago, it was over 8 million tons. That said, Cuba only consumes about 700,000 tons of sugar each year, so there's still a lot of opportunities. As for tobacco, if restrictions were completely eliminated, the upside is estimated, restrictions from the US were completely eliminated. The upside is estimated at about $200 million per year in cigar sales. Habanos is currently selling about $450 million per year in exports, so if US barriers were completely removed, Cuba would be neck and neck with the Dominican Republic in terms of cigar export sales. Can I have the next slide, please? The last sector we're going to talk about specifically is technology, and in many senses, technology is going to be the #1 barrier of entry for doing business in Cuba. The government has a tight control on the technology sector, not just telephony, but technology in general. Internet access is the second slowest in the world after Equatorial Guinea. It's also very expensive. Telecommunications in general suffers from underinvestment and major gaps in service quality, reliability, uptime, and whatnot. As far as consumers go, about 23 out of every 100 residents had a cell phone last year. Public areas with Wi-Fi were just launched at 35 locations around Cuba, and Wi-Fi is not free. They pay high prices for it, but it's access they never had before. So people don't have to wait in long lines at navigation rooms for a computer to free up. They can just go to the public park and use their prepaid Nalta account to connect to the Wi-Fi, assuming they have a device. The advances in technology are going to be largely a policy decision from the Cuban government. This is a sector where we really have to keep in mind that market forces are not at work unless the government says so. The last point I want to touch on here is financial services and payments technology, which is very important to the way many of us are accustomed to doing business. If all goals are met, there will be a total of around 4,000 point-of-sale machines for processing credit and debit cards nationwide in Cuba at the end of this year. So that's a very low number. So payments technology is also highly underserved in Cuba. Could I have the next slide, please? Now we're going to talk a little bit about foreign investments. Cuba's foreign investment law came into effect in June of 2014, and I've highlighted here some of the major incentives that were created under the law. There's three that we're going to talk about specifically. Direct hiring is first. Under the law, you do not get to negotiate freely for employment. So if you meet someone and you want to offer them a job, you can't. You have to work through a state employment agency. Second, the law reduces the corporate tax from 30% to 15%, which is a major adjustment, and the first 8 years FDI projects are exempt from profit tax, so it's zero rated. The third thing I want to mention is the three models available, which for the first time allows for 100% foreign-owned companies as well as JVs. Then there's also what they call the international economic associations, like management contracts for hotels, contracts for services, and so on. Actually, there's a fourth thing, which is the repatriation of profits, which is now allowed under the current framework. There's a different law for investments in the Mariel Special Development Zone. The holiday tax for investments in Mariel is 10 years. The holiday tax, that's my Spanish. The tax holiday is for 10 years, with the rate is set at 12% after that. One of the advantages in Mariel is that companies get to negotiate salaries, so there's no fixed tariffs. Again, there's a promise for profits to be repatriated. And you know, while the government promises rule of law and no expropriations, only time is really going to tell whether they're going to fall through on that. So we just kind of have to wait that one out and see. In the meantime, one of the gauges that we refer to is the Index of Economic Freedom. While Cuba's score has been improving in recent years, the country ranks second to last in the world, only ahead of North Korea. And it continues to score very low on property rights and financial freedom. Could I have the next slide, please? Moving on to sectors for foreign investment. On the slide, you can get a better feel for the distribution of projects by sector that the government's currently looking to promote. The total number of projects in Mariel is 25 that the government's promoting, and then for FDI projects outside of Mariel, there's 221 projects being promoted. So that's 246 projects in 11 sectors nationwide and valued at $8.7 billion. The government of Cuba is seeking $2.5 billion per year in FDI. There have been a total of 6 projects approved, with 5 companies authorized just recently. 5 of the 6 have opted for the 100% foreign capital model. The government says that they've received applications for over 300 projects so far. A few of the projects that have been approved, Mexico's Rich Meat is establishing a meat processing and packaging plant. Also from Mexico, Devex General Paint will produce a residential and industrial anti-corrosive paint line, and that's going to be for the local market and for export markets. Spain-based Hotelsa is developing a food and beverage plant that will service the tourism sector. Could I have the next slide, please? All right, now getting into risks and opportunities. This slide recaps a lot of the things that I've been talking about already. Cuba continues to pay the price for past underinvestment. Infrastructure problems will take time to fix, and they need to be considered when evaluating opportunities in Cuba to see if the timing is right and if the business model, your business model, can wait for the infrastructure to be put in place. Regarding commodity prices, particularly nickel and sugar, these are 2 indexes to follow to give you an idea of the trade dynamics. The situation in Venezuela is also very important to follow. the pace of evolving relations with the U.S. and developments in Congress related to Cuba will be very important to keep an eye on. The pace of domestic reforms in Cuba and Cuba's capacity to respond to the U.S. reforms. Timing of FDI will also be very critical to bringing in the foreign currency and also to improving technology. FDI projects that have been announced, they're in planning or they're in early execution phases. So we're not likely to see a major impact in activity this year as a result of that. Finally, the growing number of private workers are the cuentapropistas. There are now over 500,000 people licensed to be self-employed. Cubans are very entrepreneurial, they're very innovative. And we really expect that the more freedom people have to really exercise these skills, we expect to see some very interesting businesses and innovations coming out of Cuba. I also believe that the opportunity to really harness these talents is going to bring a lot of new possibilities to companies that decide to do business in Cuba. Cuba is also a great place to launch pilot projects, and so we expect to see a lot of that coming too. Can I have the final slide? So that's basically what I brought here for you today. And before we transition into the Q&A session, we'd like to thank you, and our team has also created a discount code for anyone participating today that has not yet purchased the Cuba Business Outlook 2016. So we wanted to let you know about that. You can learn more about the report at globalnewsmatters.com/Cuba. And the coupon code for checkout is webinar100, that's in lowercase, which is going to give you $100 off our current pricing. So now we would like to take some questions from the crowd, and so I'll stop talking and hand it back to Ray. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa, and thank you, Marla, for those insightful presentations. And let me encourage everyone again to, if you have any questions for either Marla or Melissa or both, to please submit your question, and we'll hopefully get to all of them. We will be going on for the next 8 minutes till 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, and we'll take it from there. So I want to start in terms of asking, and Melissa, I guess we can begin with you in terms of what, in your opinion, needs to occur for us to begin to see a material increase in investment in Cuba. What are some of the first signs, in addition to and assuming the lifting of the embargo, but even in spite of that?
I think that and that's a great question. I really appreciate that. I think that one of the things we need to see is infrastructure. There's just an absence of the level of infrastructure. Infrastructure gives a lot of confidence to investors. Are you going to build a hotel if there's no electricity line to go to it? How long is it going to take the electricity line, the served water pipes, the network access? How long is it going to take to get that there? So I think that that's one of the things that we're going to really need to see. One of the things that I'm excited about is seeing the opportunity for some multilateral lenders to actually get to start to do business with Cuba. I think that could provide a lot for the country in general, because it can help them work through some of these things, as well as general policy changes. There's I also mentioned this too. There's going to have to happen. We're going to have to see some policy changes in Cuba on things like, what is their policy for developing infrastructure? What is their policy for maintaining infrastructure? I mean, all of these things need to evolve as well in order to give the investors the confidence. And then of course there's so many limitations in place. I think that we're going to have to see things moving at a faster pace between the two countries if we're looking at U.S. Companies that are going to be investing in Cuba.
Thank you, Marla. Do you have any input on that? Where's the money going to come from? I mean, Melissa mentioned the multilateral institutions, but I would suppose that there's going to have to be some private sector. Is the Odebrecht-Mariel models a blueprint for moving forward on developing infrastructure?
I want to agree with Melissa that there needs to be a better articulation of their development policy. We saw that CAF, to Melissa's point about multilaterals, uh, demonstrating that they are willing to do business with Cuba. But I think we need to have better communication so that international investors can understand what your strategy is going to be, how you're going to finance it, what are the specific infrastructure projects that you're going to implement, and we can get a better sense of, therefore, what are the sectors, what are the types of businesses that are going to benefit from that. And again, to your point, Ray, it's critical for us to determine exactly where the US dollars are going to come from. I mean, pharmaceuticals is big as well as tourism, but we still have a gap, financing gap in terms of the quantum of exports versus imports. And that's going to be a big challenge simply because they have grown accustomed structurally for decades to having a lifeline thrown at them from the Soviets as well as Venezuela, where US dollars was not that much of a critical factor. That is changing. And so the whole mindset and the whole structure of the economy has to adapt to that new reality.
Okay, and now I was able to travel to Cuba a couple, well, not that long ago, and the tourism infrastructure is still quite behind the infrastructure of some other Caribbean countries. In terms of that sector, which seems to be maybe the lowest hanging fruit, what do you anticipate is going to happen, and do we anticipate the Spaniards who have been the leaders in that space to continue, or do we expect to anticipate other players coming into the market?
I think, yeah, the
I'll go ahead
Spanish have.
and answer this one. Oh, I'm sorry.
Well, Melissa, you go ahead.
About
Melissa?
that, I wasn't sure who it was directed to.
Oh,
So
I'm
there's,
sorry.
yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. All right. So there's actually there's been a lot of projects announced recently. So we're seeing there's a Covarrubias, Meliá has an investment in Cuba. Beijing Enterprises announced a $460 million golf club project in Belmonte. And Gowai also just recently announced its intention to invest. There's a lot of other projects in the works. So I don't think it's just going to be the Spaniards. I think we're going to see it coming from different places in the world. And again, the infrastructure piece is absolutely key. There's a plan for airport development, but we've also seen several different plans. Like a plan's announced, and then another plan's announced a few weeks later, and so it's just like, okay, well, which one is it? Announced by government? No, not announced by media, but actually announced by government. So I think as Marla was saying before, as we get clear on the infrastructure development, that's really what's gonna move the needle. And then of course we're seeing the investment and interest coming from different parts of the world.
Now, if Melissa, I mean, if you had to rank in the top three industries that you anticipate will be attracting investment in Cuba, which ones would they be?
Very interesting question. So I think that there's going to be a lot in general of opportunity opening up for small businesses to work with Cuba. So we're not going to only see like large corporations that have access or opportunity in this market. I think we're going to see a lot of small businesses as well. So because of that, tourism I think is one where we're going to see opportunities for smaller investments, $50,000 investment, a $200,000 investment to come in and actually put together different types of businesses. So I think that that's one of the ones where we're going to see a lot of activity. Not necessarily that it has to be a $200 million investment or a multi-hundred million dollar investment. Trade is another one. If the trade sector is not performing better than it is now, things just are not going to move in Cuba, and I think the government's well aware of that. And then the other one is agriculture. Like I said, only half of the arable lands are actually being cultivated in Cuba. You have a gap where you have 1.8 million tons of sugar being produced, and you had a few decades ago 8 million tons. So it's a huge gap. There's a lot that can be done, and so I think that that's the other area. And then Mariel is also, it's a very attractive area. And so I think that we will see some manufacturing and different things going into Mariel as well.
Well, I think in terms of there's obviously an underutilization of capacity, so there's a tremendous amount of upside. But I think it's also important to keep in mind that we're still talking about a country of 11 million people and a relatively small economy. So there's a lot of room to grow. I think there's still a lot of work to be done, particularly on the policy front. And the Cubans have a lot of work to do to come to grips with exactly what their model is going to be moving forward. Well, this we have reached 12:30. This concludes our webinar. I want to thank Marla and Melissa for their presentations, and I want to thank everyone for who has attended and heard the presentation. Remember, there is the coupon for the Global News Matters Cuba Business Outlook. Remember, webinar 100 in small caps. And thank you again, and hopefully we will see you at the next one. Thank you all.